Okay, so now the very first part is called the autolyse stage, which is when you take your quantity of flour, which in this case we have 500 grams, and your quantity of water, which is 360 grams, and you mix them together to give the flour a chance to get hydrated while not activating the yeast. And so while I'm doing that, I'm gonna go ahead and explain to you guys a little bit about why it's important to do these metric measurements. The big part of the reason is that when you do like cup measurements and stuff like that, it doesn't really account for weight, right? It only accounts for volume. And so metric measurements are typically more accurate when it comes to baking anyway. So yeah, so if you can do them, that's good. But yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and mix this, and then we're gonna let it sit for 20 to 30 minutes, all right? All right, so it's been our 20 to 30 minutes, and now I'm gonna show y'all what this looks like. It smells nice and yeasty. The dough should look like this. And now we're gonna do the fun part of adding the salt and the yeast. So we're gonna go ahead and mix the yeast, which the yeast is really the only thing I use a non-metric measure for, just because the weight is so small. But for this, I use half a teaspoon of active dry yeast, and I use 10 to 11 grams of sea salt. But I have this fun Turkish spice grinder, so I have like the coarse sea salt crystals, and I grind them down to a very fine powder. Right? So that's the salt. Okay, so now to incorporate the ingredients, I recommend that you have like a glass of water or something next to you, because you'll probably have to re-wet your hands so the dough doesn't stick to it. But you're basically going to scoop up the edges, and you're going to pull them into the middle. And just make sure you scrape the bottom of your bowl or tub or whatever as you do it, just to make sure that you get everything out of the bowl. Alright. So that's after just doing one pass, right? And so essentially what you're going to do for the next 5 minutes is just that. Like, you're going to pull on the edges, bring them up to the center of the dough, and keep doing that to basically just fuse everything into it. And then after you do this maybe like 2 or 3 times, I'm only going to do it 2 for right now, you're going to do what's called the pincer method, or the pinching method, where you essentially just grab the dough and pinch it. And this is supposed to mimic, like, if you've seen like those KitchenAid mixers and they're like hook attachments, this is basically supposed to mimic that. So you go ahead and pinch it. Re-wet my hand. You let it sit for a bit, and then we go ahead and refold back into the imagined center of the dough. So once you finish the mixing part, you'll have like a little round ball of dough that's kind of looks all compressed and just sitting at the edge of your tub.
Looks like a blackfish.
And now we're going to enter the bulk fermentation stage, which is the long part. We're going to be here for about 5 hours, so I'm not going to film all of this. But what you're going to want to do is, once you do this, you're going to cover it. And obviously if you don't have like a tub with a lid, you can just use like saran wrap and like put a rubber band around it. Just make sure you have a nice tight seal. Okay. So now that I've had a chance to actually brush my hair and change my clothes, I'm going to show you all the folds, which you have to do 2 folds, and they should occur in the first hour and a half of this 5-hour waiting period. I forgot to film the first fold, so I'm going to show you the second. So the folding is basically the same thing, like it's the same technique that you use like when we were incorporating the ingredients. Come closer. But it's essentially the whole pulling. Pulling the edges to the center again, and just kind of making sure you get anything that might be at the bottom. Basically, it's called folds because you're basically just folding the dough over onto itself again. And you'll notice that as it sits here, it like flattens out, so that's why like you're kind of just folding it back up. And this is supposed to just, you know, just make the loaf more tense, allow it to rise better. But yeah. So the bulk fermentation is done, and so now we have to move on to shaping and proofing the loaf. It should look like this. All right, nice and gassy. It's spread out all across the tub. So we're gonna get it out by kind of sprinkling a little bit of flour along the edges. It'll help loosen it from the tub. So you want to make sure to dump out your dough on a well-floured surface, floury hands, and we're essentially going to do the same technique that we did for folding, which is you're going to pull the edges and bring them to the center. There isn't necessarily a number of times that you're supposed to do it, you just do it until it's like more or less tight, and then we'll move on to the next part. So after you've gone and folded it up, you're going to flip it over so the seam is on the underside. And you kind of want to move the flour off of your surface because it's going to make this next part a lot easier. But basically you're going to kind of cup the dough in your hands and then you're going to pull it towards you. And you should feel some friction with whatever surface you're working on. And this is going to allow the ball to tighten up. Come closer, observe. So you'll see now we have a nice tight ball. You don't want to pull so hard that you tear the top either, but it's nice, tight, round, small. You know, it's going to do its final rise when it proofs. So we have our proofing basket. It's nice and floured. If you don't have a proofing basket, it's not a big deal. Just use like a bowl or whatever. Just make sure that it is well floured because otherwise it will stick. So then we're just going to gently pull it up. And we're just going to put it in the proofing basket. So now that it's sitting in this proofing basket, you want to make sure you cover it. I just use this little cloth that comes with the proofing basket, but if you're using a bowl or anything else, just use a kitchen towel, it's fine. And we're going to let it proof for about an hour and 15 minutes. The timing really depends on how warm your kitchen is. Mine usually takes about an hour, but I would recommend maybe like 50 minutes, an hour in. You can open it, poke the dough, don't stab it, poke it lightly, and it should bounce back. If it bounces back, you're good, it's probably ready to go. If you push it and it doesn't bounce back, then it's starting to get overproof, so that would mean you want to start right away. So I didn't get to finish recording this video because the last couple of steps happened pretty quickly, but what you're going to do is while your loaf is proofing, you're going to turn on your oven and set it somewhere between 450 to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. It's kind of important that you have either like an oven thermometer or just like some way to accurately measure the temperature in your oven. So that's key. Two, while the oven is heating, you're going to take your cast iron pot and put it in the oven. It's important that the pot heat while the oven's heating because when you actually put your loaf into the pot needs to be hot. Like the loaf needs to start cooking once it's already in it. And cast iron pots retain heat really well, but they also take a while to heat up. So if you stick a cold loaf into a cold pot into a hot oven, it's just like the loaf it's not going to cook the way it needs to cook. But yeah, so once your loaf finishes proving, you're going to take your cast iron pot out of the oven, take the lid off, and you're going to dump out the loaf onto like a floured surface. So the seam side that was originally face down in the bowl or the proofing basket that you were using is now going to be facing up, and you're kind of just going to drop it into the pot. Don't worry too much about like the structure or whatever, just like gently just pick it up and drop it. You're going to put the lid back on, put it back in the oven, and you're going to cook it at that temperature, bake it at that temperature for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, you're going to take it out, take the lid off, and then you're going to finish baking it for 15 to 20 minutes. Now, the 15 to 20 minute range, you want to probably check it at 15 minutes and see if it's like starting to get too dark or if it's like a nice color. You know, like you can make it a little darker than like what you would usually consider as like a good color for a loaf, just because the darker color gives it like a nice flavor. But if you don't want that, that's fine. But yeah, so then after that, you'll take it out of the oven. It's important also to take it out of the pot right when it comes out of the oven. If you let it sit in the pot, the bottom of it is just gonna take in, like the moisture is just gonna accumulate there from the heat. and then the bottom will just get soggy and you'll have a soggy bottom. So then you will take it, try and flip it out of the pot just carefully. It's going to be very hot, onto a counter or anything like that. If you have a wire rack to cool it on, put it on there. If you don't, that's fine. Just leave the bread kind of on its side. It'll stand up by itself. But yeah, you'll get to hear it crackle a little bit while it finishes cooking, which is always a fun thing. So just let it cool down for a bit. If you really don't want to wait, you really don't have to wait more than like 30 seconds to a minute if you want to dive right in and have really warm bread. Or else you can just wait a little bit longer. It'll still be crunchy and delicious. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Cut it to your liking. While it's still warm, if you need to store it away, put it in like a paper bag if you have one. But once it's cooled down, store it in a plastic bag. Yeah, I think that's all I got. But good luck with this. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Thanks.